The late afternoon sun beat down on the cracked dirt of the Red Ridge Rodeo Arena, turning the air into a shimmer of heat that clung to every surface. The scent of hay, sweat, and tension hung thick in the air. Dusty, a striking chestnut Mustang with a white blaze running down his muzzle, stood at the center of the ring. His coat glistened beneath the dust, muscles taut with exhaustion. He was proud, regal even, but clearly worn down from whatever came before. And then, with no warning, the arena went silent. What followed would change everything. Brock Vance, clad in black leather and arrogance, stepped forward with the swagger of someone who had never paid the price for anything in his life. He didn't hesitate. His heavy boot struck the Mustang's ribs with a thud that echoed louder than the gasps from the crowd. Dusty collapsed sideways, legs folding underneath him, muzzle sinking into the dirt. A sound escaped the horse, not a whinny, but something deeper, something like heartbreak. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Old cowboys gripped the rails with white knuckles. Others turned their faces away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not even the rodeo hands, frozen between duty and fear. Brock glanced around, smirking, almost daring someone to say something. He saw no threat, just a sea of stunned silence. But what he didn't see was Eli Mercer. At the far end of the arena, leaning against the fence in a weathered hat and sun-worn denim, stood a man carved from years of wind, grief, and grit. Eli didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He just watched. His eyes, a cold steel gray, locked on the Mustang, on his Mustang. Dusty wasn't just a horse. He was the last thing Eli had left of his wife. Her final gift before the cancer took her. That horse was family. And Brock had just kicked family. Something ancient stirred in Eli's chest. Not rage. Not yet. Something older. Deeper. The kind of pain that simmers in silence, waiting for the right moment to rise. Brock had made a mistake. Not just of cruelty, but of ignorance. He thought no one was watching. But someone was. Someone who knew exactly what it meant to lose everything, and how to protect what little was left. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, pretending nothing happened, Eli stayed exactly where he was. Still. Unblinking. Waiting. Because justice doesn't always come loud. Sometimes, it comes quiet, on the heels of dust and memory. If Dusty's pain moved you, hit like and subscribe. This story needs to be seen. Comment, "I saw what he did," to show you were watching when no one else dared to speak. Let's give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. The roar of Brock's Harley broke through the Texas dusk like a warning. He didn't look back as he rode down the dirt road, dust curling in his wake like ghosts chasing after him. To the others, Brock was a drifter, a man who appeared out of nowhere and took whatever space he wanted. No one knew where he came from. No one dared ask. But behind the tattoos and the leather was a man carrying more than attitude. There was a reason for the rage in his fists, the weight behind his boot. It didn't excuse what he did. But it hinted at a fire that hadn't always been his fault. He pulled into the back lot of an old mechanic shop, killing the engine with a rough twist. A young man in overalls, thin, pale, barely 20, stood by the garage door, eyes wide, like a dog expecting a slap. Brock said nothing. He tossed a crumpled bag of fast food toward the kid and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled, though he'd never admit it. The silence between them was familiar. Brock didn't talk about feelings. He only left bruises or silence. And yet, there were nights when the boy heard Brock mumble names in his sleep, names that didn't belong to this town. Back at the arena, Eli remained long after the crowd had gone. Dusty stood now, though his body trembled. The Mustang's eyes found Eli's through the fence, as if apologizing, as if asking why this had happened. Eli placed a hand on the wood, knuckles pale. "Not your fault, boy," he muttered, voice barely audible. That moment, that connection, It cut deeper than any punch. Dusty had been with him through the worst of it. When the house grew quiet after his wife passed, it was Dusty's breath in the barn that kept him grounded. Now, someone had dared to violate that peace. Eli wasn't a violent man. But he wasn't passive either. He came from a generation that believed in accountability, not vengeance, but reckoning. And in Brock, he saw more than a thug. He saw something familiar. A man cracked open by something invisible. But that didn't change the fact that the line had been crossed. Deep down, Eli knew this wouldn't end with a confrontation. It would be a process. A slow, deliberate unraveling. He walked Dusty back to the stable, each step echoing in the fading light. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Dusty limped beside him, head low, but alive. For now, that was enough. But the silence between horse and man wasn't empty. It was full of something waiting to rise. And somewhere out there, Brock had no idea he'd just started a war with a man who knew how to wait. Brock sat alone in the back room of the garage that night, the bare bulb above him flickering like it wasn't sure it wanted to keep shining. His beer was warm. His mind hotter. The image of that damn horse falling still played in his head, though he wouldn't admit it even under a loaded gun. He told himself it didn't matter. It was just a horse. Just a stupid animal. But something about the way it had looked up at him, not in fear, but in shock, had crawled under his skin and stayed there, festering. On the wall above his cot hung an old photo, sun-bleached and crooked. A younger Brock, maybe 20, stood with a little boy no older than 6. Both wore the same crooked smile, the kind that doesn't come from joy but from pretending. The boy was his brother, or had been. Brock hadn't seen him in over a decade. Not since the fire. Not since everything had fallen apart. It was easier to live like this, with no roots, no past. People couldn't hurt you if you stayed moving. But pain doesn't play by the rules. It catches up eventually. Meanwhile, Eli stood on his porch in the dark, the stars sharp against the sky like they were judging him. He held a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't told anyone what he saw. Not yet. He knew the town. Folks didn't want conflict. They wanted peace, or at least the illusion of it. But illusions didn't heal bruised ribs or broken trust. And Dusty's bruises weren't just physical. Eli saw it in the way the Mustang avoided eye contact, in the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Trauma left fingerprints, even on animals. Inside the barn, Dusty lay curled in his stall, eyes half closed. Eli sat with him, cross-legged on the hay, just like he used to with his wife when they were younger. He didn't know what he was doing, Eli whispered, almost to himself. But that doesn't mean he won't do it again. His hand rested gently on Dusty's mane, and for a moment the Mustang exhaled in a long, slow sigh, the kind only a creature who's known safety before can make. Somewhere deep inside, Eli knew this wasn't just about Dusty. It was about everything he had buried. The grief. The anger. The years spent holding it all in, being the good man. But something was shifting. Brock had stirred the embers of a fire Eli thought had long gone out. And fires like that don't burn quietly for long. Morning came with the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, just tense. The sun rose behind clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. Eli was already in the barn by dawn, checking Dusty's breathing, brushing his coat with slow, deliberate strokes. The bruising was more visible now, dark patches beneath the chestnut fur, tender to the touch. Dusty flinched less today. That was something. Still, his eyes carried a dull shine, like he was trying to forget something that had branded itself into his bones. Eli knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. The radio crackled from the old shelf by the window. Small-town news, the usual chatter. Then a familiar name slipped through the static. Brock Vance. Eli froze. Apparently, someone had called in a complaint about an incident at the rodeo. The sheriff was looking into it. That was all. No arrests. No confrontation. Not yet. Eli turned the radio off. He didn't need to hear more. Words wouldn't fix anything. Only actions. Later that afternoon, Brock returned to the arena. Not for remorse. Not to explain. Just to walk it. Like a dog marking territory. He paced along the fence, hands in his pockets, cigarette dangling from his lips. His boots kicked up little puffs of dust with every step. There were a few ranchers there. They watched him from a distance but said nothing. Fear hung in the air, thick and familiar. But Brock wasn't looking for them. He was waiting. Eli stood at the opposite end, leaning against the rail, eyes locked on the man who had hurt his horse. No shouting. No dramatic standoff. Just that stare. Quiet. Heavy. It lasted too long to be casual, but neither man broke it. Brock narrowed his eyes, like he was trying to remember if he'd seen Eli before. Something in his posture changed, just slightly. He lit another cigarette and turned away. But the message had been sent. He knew. Someone had seen. That night, Eli found himself in his wife's old sewing room, a place he hadn't entered in years. Tucked inside a drawer was a worn notebook. Inside, pressed between pages, was a picture. A boy with sun-bleached hair, maybe 5 years old, feeding a chestnut foal. The horse had the same white blaze Dusty carried now. A note in his wife's handwriting on the back read, "Boys and horses, they feel each other's pain." Eli sat down, staring at the photo. The world was smaller than it looked. And sometimes, pain traveled in circles, waiting for the right moment to come back home. The wind picked up that night, rustling through the dry trees around Eli's property like a warning whispered through the branches. The photo had stayed on the table, next to a half-empty cup of cold coffee, as if it was waiting for him to look at it again. And he did. Over and over. The image of the boy and the foal stirred something that had been buried deep, not grief this time, but recognition. That face. Those eyes. Eli rubbed his temple. It couldn't be. The years had weathered too much. But something in his gut told him otherwise. The next morning, Eli drove into town, not for groceries or feed, but for answers. He stopped by the sheriff's office, a modest building with flaking paint and a tired American flag swaying in the wind. Sheriff McLean was an old friend, the kind who didn't ask questions unless he had to. When Eli mentioned Brock Vance's name, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, sighing like he'd been expecting this. "He's trouble, that one," he muttered. "Came from down near El Paso. Said he was just passing through. Been living out behind the old garage. Keeps to himself." Eli asked to see the intake form. Nothing official, just basic records. And that's when he saw it, mother's name, Rachel Vance. The breath caught in his throat. That was the same Rachel who had worked on his ranch 2 decades ago, when his wife was still alive. A quiet, kind girl who had left town suddenly. Pregnant. Eli remembered his wife's concern, how she'd packed her a bag and left some money on the nightstand in the bunkhouse. No one ever saw her again. Until now. Brock wasn't just a stranger. He was connected. A name from a past Eli had chosen to forget had come back in the form of a broken man with rage in his boots. And suddenly, everything made a terrible kind of sense. The bitterness, the fury, the emptiness behind those eyes. A child raised without answers. A life built on silence and resentment. Eli wasn't sure what Rachel had told her son, but he knew now that he was part of whatever Brock had turned into. Back on the ranch, Dusty neighed softly, sensing the tension that hung over the land like a storm waiting to break. Eli stood outside the barn, staring into the horizon, his heart heavy with truths that had slept too long. He had thought this was about justice for a horse. But it was really about atonement, for something he didn't even know he'd done. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should Eli tell Brock the whole truth, or is it too late to fix the past? Your voice matters, and it just might change how this story ends. The sky was bruised purple by the time Brock found himself back at the garage, the wind howling through the open windows like a voice he couldn't shut out. He paced the floor, boots echoing against concrete, his fists clenched, jaw tight. He hadn't eaten. Hadn't slept. Something had been sitting on his chest since the arena, since that old man looked at him like he knew him. Like he saw something Brock didn't even know was still there. And it rattled him in a way fists never had. He threw a wrench across the room. It clanged against the wall and dropped to the floor with a dull finality. No one had ever looked at him that way. Not with fear. Not with pity. But with memory. Brock didn't do memory. He did survival. But the longer he tried to shove it down, the more it crawled back up. The name Rachel Vance had come up in town. Someone mentioned she used to work for a rancher named Mercer. That old man. Eli Mercer. The connection was fraying his nerves. Back at the ranch, Eli sat on the edge of his bed, the photo still resting on his nightstand. He hadn't touched it in hours, but he didn't need to. It was burned into his mind now. Rachel, the quiet girl who never asked for anything. The one his wife had tried to help. He remembered the day she left, early morning, no goodbyes. Just a folded blanket and a note that said, "Tell her thank you." Now Eli wondered what Rachel had left behind besides a note. And what kind of life her son, that man, had endured. He didn't blame Brock for the anger. He didn't even blame him for the violence, not completely. Rage was inherited in ways people didn't always understand. But that didn't excuse it. A man had to take responsibility. For his choices. For the hurt he caused. And maybe Eli had his own share of debts to pay, not in action, but in silence. In the things he didn't say. In the people he didn't check on after they vanished. As the wind picked up outside, Dusty stirred in the barn, pawing gently at the floor. Eli heard it and stood, as if something inside told him to move. He stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, eyes fixed on the dark road that led back toward town. Toward Brock. Toward the truth. Some things don't come back to haunt you as ghosts. Some come back in flesh, bone, and a storm wearing your name. Brock didn't mean to go back there. Not really. His boots just started walking, like they had a mind of their own, carrying him down the dusty back road that curved toward Mercer Ranch. The moonlight traced shadows on the gravel as the wind tugged at his jacket. Each step felt heavier, like the land itself was resisting his presence. A part of him wanted to turn back. But something else, something deeper, kept him moving forward. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Need. Eli heard the bike long before he saw it. The low growl of the engine cut through the night like a blade. He was already outside, standing by the fence, arms crossed. Dusty was nearby, resting but alert, ears twitching. As Brock killed the engine and stepped off the Harley, the two men locked eyes again. This time, not from across a crowd, but from 10 paces apart. No one spoke. Not at first. The wind did all the talking, rustling the dry grass between them like it was afraid of what might be said. "I don't know why I'm here," Brock muttered, his voice hoarse, almost defiant. "I don't owe you anything." Eli didn't flinch. "You don't," he said calmly. "But maybe you owe yourself something." Brock scoffed, but it lacked conviction. He glanced at Dusty, whose brown coat shimmered under the porch light. The white blaze on his face was unmistakable. The same horse. The one he'd kicked. The one that hadn't retaliated. "It was just a horse," Brock said under his breath, as if trying to convince himself more than Eli. Eli took a slow step forward. "That horse," he said, voice low, "was the last gift my wife gave me before she died. He's all I have left of her. And you don't walk into a man's life and trample the only thing keeping him upright." There was no rage in his voice, only weight. The kind that doesn't need volume to crush someone. Brock looked away, jaw clenched. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Not the kind that begged for words, the kind that held truth. Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out the old photo. The one of the boy and the foal. He held it out, hand steady. "Is this you?" he asked quietly. And for the first time, Brock didn't have an answer. Brock stared at the photograph as if it were a ghost. The corners were worn, the image faded, but there was no denying it. That little boy with the crooked smile and scraped knees. It was him. He hadn't seen that picture since he was a child, maybe 5 or 6. He remembered the foal, remembered how it nuzzled into his chest. But more than that, he remembered the day his mother packed up and left with tears in her eyes and no explanations. The memory hit him like a sucker punch, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. He felt lost. Eli watched Brock's face carefully. He saw the wall start to crack. Not shatter, just crack. That was enough. "Your mother worked here," Eli said quietly. "She was kind. Quiet. My wife adored her. When she left, she didn't say why. But I always knew something was wrong." His voice grew heavier, edged with guilt. "We should have done more. We should have gone after her. But life got busy, and grief has a way of making you forget the living." Brock didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. He'd spent his whole life resenting shadows, men who weren't there, promises never kept. And now here he was, standing in front of one of those shadows, and it didn't look like a monster. It looked like a man. Just a tired old man with pain in his eyes and calluses on his hands. Brock didn't know what he expected. Anger? Blame? But Eli gave him none of that. Just truth. "I didn't know about you," Eli added. "Not until I saw your name on that paper. And when I saw what you did to Dusty," he paused, breathing in slow. "I wanted to hate you. God knows I tried. But something told me that wasn't the end of the story." Brock turned his eyes toward the barn, where Dusty stood in the shadows, watching them quietly. There was no fear in the horse's eyes now, only awareness. Like he could feel the weight in the air, the unraveling of something that had been twisted too tight for too long. Brock exhaled hard, like the wind had been knocked out of him. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," he finally muttered. Eli nodded slowly. "Neither do I," he said. "But maybe you start by not running this time." The morning came gray and slow, like even the sky wasn't sure how to feel. Eli stood by the barn doors, a cup of black coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise try to break through the clouds. Dusty was outside for the first time since the incident, walking slowly, grazing, his chestnut coat catching what little light there was. He looked stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. And in some quiet way, Eli felt the same. Brock hadn't left. He spent the night out near the fence, sleeping beside his bike, jacket pulled tight around him. It wasn't about pride anymore. He didn't have the words, didn't know the right moves, but something in him refused to leave. Maybe he was tired of disappearing. Maybe the silence he'd always carried finally had somewhere to rest. When he walked up to the barn that morning, he didn't speak. He just stood next to Eli, shoulder to shoulder, as the Mustang looked up and met his gaze. Dusty didn't flinch. Instead, the horse stepped forward, slow and steady, and sniffed the air between them. Brock stood still, every muscle in his body tense. But when Dusty gently touched his muzzle to Brock's hand, something gave. His shoulders dropped, His eyes turned glassy, and for the first time, he didn't fight the feeling. He let it rise, the guilt, the sorrow, the weight of everything unsaid. Eli watched, saying nothing. Some moments don't need to be filled with words. After a long pause, Brock spoke, voice low, rough like gravel. "My mom, she told me about this place. Said it was the only place she ever felt safe." He looked out across the ranch, the old fences, the fields beyond. "I always thought she left because of me. Thought I wasn't enough. Turns out, she was running from everything, and maybe trying to protect me from it too." Eli nodded slowly, the silence between them now warm instead of cold. "She wasn't weak, Brock. She was scared. And she did what she thought was right." He hesitated, then added, "But she wasn't alone. We should have done better by her. I should have." There it was, the shared burden. Two men, both carrying pieces of the same broken past, finally admitting they didn't have to do it alone. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grass around them. Brock looked down at Dusty, then back at Eli. "I don't want to keep running," he said. "I just don't know where to start." Eli gave a half-smile, weathered and real. "You already did." The days that followed moved quietly, like the land itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. Brock stayed on the ranch, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as something in between. He took to the chores without being asked, fed the animals, fixed a few fences, repaired a broken hinge on the barn door that Eli had ignored for months. He worked in silence, but it wasn't the silence of anger anymore. It was the kind that builds, that heals, one slow hour at a time. Eli watched him from a distance most days, unsure of the shape this new chapter would take. He was an old man, not naive enough to expect some dramatic transformation overnight. But he saw it, in the way Brock approached Dusty now, cautious but calm. In the way he asked questions about Rachel, his mother, as if he was finally piecing together a version of her that wasn't just built on pain. It wasn't closure exactly. Maybe there's no such thing. But it was something. And for two men who'd spent their lives holding things in, something was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in deep orange and blue, Brock sat on the porch beside Eli. Neither spoke for a while. Just watched Dusty graze in the pasture, his coat glowing in the fading light. "He's strong," Brock said finally, nodding toward the Mustang. "I don't know how after what I did." Eli took a sip of his coffee, then looked at Brock. "Because strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about what you do after." He paused. "And that horse, he chose to forgive you. That's not weakness. That's trust." The words settled between them, soft and heavy. Brock looked down at his hands, then out at the land. For once, he didn't feel like a stranger to it. Later that night, Brock stood in the barn alone, brushing Dusty's mane under the warm glow of the overhead lamp. The horse leaned into his touch, gentle, calm. Brock closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deep, not just of the hay and the wood and the dust, but of something older. Something he didn't have a name for. Maybe peace. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe home. Eli, watching from the doorway, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Some stories don't end with fireworks or big gestures. Some end with quiet, with understanding. With a man standing beside a horse he once broke, now helping it heal. And maybe, just maybe, healing himself in the process. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Stories like this deserve to be told, and your support makes it possible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.